going here. And good morning and hello, Plainsboro, New Jersey, my first time there. And thank you for attending. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been a journalist since 1971. And I got into journalism because of a guy by the name of Joe Dionisio, although I wanted to get into journalism when I was 3 years old. And he was my 11th grade English teacher at Spring Valley High School, Rockland County, New York, and didn't know any of our names and looked around, student. And he says to me, hey, you got a good voice. How would you like to be on radio? I said, oh, I want to be on radio so bad. I want to be on radio so bad, so bad. So he put me on radio, WRKL radio, and it was a show, a weekly show called Tiger Talk. It was on every Tuesday afternoon at 3:45 in the afternoon, one of the worst shows ever aired, but it was my start. And I was on with Gene Delisio along with Doris Ham. Fast forward about 6.5 years later, I'm working for a radio station by the name of WGRC. That's in Nanuet, New York, also in Rockland County, about 20 miles north of the George Washington Bridge. And we used to get all of the New York City politicians coming through Rockland County because we were with AP and we were with UPI. And they knew if they came, they left New York City and came to the suburb, they get publicity. Steve North is my news director. His father actually worked for Walter Cronkite and was also the stage manager of the Johnny Carson show when it was in New York. And Steve said to me, Saturday, go down and do, just go cover the New York State Democrats are holding a fundraiser. Don't worry about getting anything immediately. Wait until Monday morning. There's no need for that. And I was 21 years old, and I'd been out of college for a year, graduated college in '77, got the job there. And among the people I was interviewing immediately was Ralph Nader and Julian Bond, as Rockland Community College had a speaker series, and I was going to the speaker series. But this is late March, and the Democrats are at the Tappan Zee Townhouse, and they start walking in. And you might know some of these people, maybe you don't. I don't know. I mean, some of them never did anything. The first guy to walk in was an obscure assemblyman by the name of Gerald Nadler, Jerry Nadler. Anybody ever hear of Gerald Nadler? And then Hugh Carey walks in, and Mario Cuomo was there running for lieutenant governor at the time, and he brings his oldest son, Andrew, with him, and his little son, Chris, with him, and Matilda is there as well, his wife. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan is there. And then there's this tall guy. This tall guy, he really looked like he was out of the movies. He had sandy, brownish gray hair, really good looking. And he walks right over to me. And he looks at me, and I knew who he was because, hey, I'm only 21, and even though I had a kind of an afro there and a mustache on his face, but I knew who he was because I watched Batman, and he was the mayor of Gotham City. It was John Lindsay, and John Lindsay told me he's running for Senate, state of New York, and I have a scoop. I have a scoop, tells it to me. I'm done for the day. I run back to my 500-watt radio station and file the report immediately. Call the Associated Press, Marlene Egg. File it with her immediately, and then file it with United Press International, Randy Berlage. File it with him immediately. And then I get a call from WNEW in New York, and some people might remember WNEW, which was 1130 on the dial, and that was the station of Sinatra and Tony Bennett, Nat King Cole, and Peggy Lee, and Ella Fitzgerald, and it's Henry Marcotte on the phone. And he says to me, we'd like you to do that story for us. I said, how much are you going to pay me? He said, $10. Sold. And at the age of 21, I'm on a 50,000-watt radio station in New York, WNEW. Spent 3.5 years covering various news for them, including interviewing Ronald Reagan, interviewing Ted Kennedy, and covering the returning hostages from Iran. I was up at Stewart Air Force Base on that cold, cold day in January of 1981. It's 2 degrees, and we never got a chance to talk to the hostages. That is Richard Nixon. That is a backwards autograph of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the president of the United States in 1973. and Richard Nixon got involved in something called Watergate. And so happens that you saw the interview, the autograph of Nixon, and this is backwards. This is a Larry O'Brien basketball, NBA basketball. And Larry was commissioner of the NBA. Got to know him. Nixon I get to know because he arbitrates the baseball umpires dispute in 1985 and gives the umpires a 40% pay raise. And it is Richard Nixon and the Watergate burglars who break into Larry O'Brien's office at the Watergate Hotel. This happens in 1972, and it would be a 2-year odyssey that the country would go through. And I knew both Nixon and also Larry O'Brien. But 1973, an awful lot of things happened. There is John Dean, who turned on Nixon. John Dean is still around on CNN giving advice. That is H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff. That is Ehrlichman, another one of Nixon's people, John Ehrlichman. And there is Spiro Agnew, who started 1973 as the vice president of the United States and ended 1973 as the former vice president of the United States. That is Paris. The Paris peace talks conclude with the United States and Vietnam agreeing to end the war. A war that started in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson was given powers by the United States Congress. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, sending more and more and more troops to Vietnam, reaching about 500,000 men and women. A woman who sat and listened to my 1968 talk said, I was a little disappointed in you. I said, why is that? She said, everything was fine except for one thing. You did not mention that there were women in Vietnam, and there were women in Vietnam. So 500,000 men and women in Vietnam at the height. The war would end in 1973. And another war would start. That would be the Yom Kippur War, which started in the fall of 1973. And some of us old timers remember this. Sorry, no gas. The gas crisis of 1973, that was in reaction to Americans helping out Israel during the Yom Kippur War. That is Billie Jean King on the left. That is Bobby Riggs on the right. You might remember the Battle of the Sexes, which was produced by my friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who passed away in February of 2019. And I'll get into that. I'll get into that a little later. But if you remember 1973, and against women, Riggs Pigs against Billie Jean King, brought to you by my friend Shelley. Secretariat won the Belmont over 30 lengths in front of anybody else or any other horse. And Watergate, of course, is the big topic. That is the Watergate Hotel. That is me there about 8 years after the infamous break-in by the plumbers of the Watergate Hotel. And that happens in 1972, but that's going to hang over America and the world in 1973 and 74. January 8th of 1973, the Watergate break-in trial begins, and the accused are Virgilio González, Bernard Baker, James McCord, Eugenio Martínez, and Frank Sturgis. And they were the 5 guys who were caught inside the Watergate Hotel. And there they are with their mugshots. They were the burglars, and actually the burglars once got together, or they got together in 1971. The dry run for Watergate was breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. If you remember Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, he was the guy who wanted to release the Pentagon Papers and did release the Pentagon Papers, the book form, talking about all the lies and deceptions that the Johnson administration, Robert McNamara, gave when they were getting the war in Vietnam ramped up. And there was Lyndon Johnson. Now, take a look at Lyndon Johnson's hair in this picture. It's kind of interesting. He's got long sideburns and he's got long hair because one of his aides had long hair and down in Texas. And he said, why do you have such long hair? He said, because all those guys have crew cuts, referring to Nixon's guys. If you looked at Haldeman and everybody else, they had crew cuts. So Johnson grew his hair out of defiance against Nixon. On January 18th, 1973, Lyndon Johnson passed away. suffered a heart attack and died. He had heart trouble. He had a heart attack when he was majority leader of the Senate back in the 1950s. Nixon takes office January 20th for the second time, 1973, and there is his wife, Pat, good Republican woman, and there is Nixon taking the oath of office. On January 20th, 1973, also sworn in for a second term as vice president is Spiro Agnew. That is the Supreme Court of the United States, 1973, and they would come down with a very important ruling in January of 1973. It was January 22nd, Roe versus Wade. 410 U.S. 113, 7-2 court decision. The United States Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. For the last 47 years, we have been fighting that battle in the United States, and that battle continues. Roe versus Wade. Vietnam, still going on in January of 1973, but the end is almost near. On January 23rd, 3 days after Richard Nixon is sworn in again, he announces that an accord had been reached to end the Vietnam War. And why did it come to a sudden end? Because the United States did a massive bombing campaign in December of 1972 using the big bombs like that. December 18th of 1972, 5 days after a breakdown in the peace talks, Nixon announced the start of Christmas bombing of North Vietnam. The American B-52 bombers dropped about 20,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong, and that was the end of the war. Vietnam decided to fold up because too much was going on at that point. The United States did lose 15 of the B-52s and 11 other aircrafts during the attack. The North Vietnamese said that 1,600 civilians were killed. The bombings ended on December 29th. North Vietnam decided, let's go back to Paris, let's resume the peace talks, and within 3 weeks there was an agreement to end the war. Now, Richard Nixon in 1971, 1972 was starting his re-election campaign. And look at this. Like I said, I kind of knew Nixon. And his re-election campaign is called Committee for the Re-election of the President. Short, it's called CREEP. CREEP, the Re-election of the President. C-R-E-E-P, CREEP. Now, my dealings with Nixon, he was a very, very strange guy. He had no problem with me. We never had a problem. I met him about 22 times. But you could see there was some paranoia about him. And anybody who names his election, or anybody who allows the name of his re-election campaign CREEP, it's kind of creepy, isn't it? Well, it was CREEP, Committee for the Re-election of the President. The Vietnam War, and here's, this was his problem back in 1971, 1972. The Vietnam War was continuing. The American economy was a mess. In the 1970 midterms, the Democrats won the popular vote in the House by 8.7%. They added a dozen seats, and in 1971, Nixon's popularity drops below 50%. Apparently, the silent majority wasn't too happy, and he named the silent majority on November 3rd, 1969. There he is. There's the autograph of Richard Nixon. And there is the basketball. And you can see right up close, it says Lawrence O'Brien, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. I was 16 years old in 1972. I was in 11th grade going into 12th grade. Little did I realize that one day, at one time, I would be somebody who knew the two main combatants in the 1972 Watergate affair, Richard Nixon and Lawrence O'Brien. That's G. Gordon Liddy. He was a lawyer, and he was a guy who cooked up all these schemes or some of the schemes for Richard Nixon. In 1972, he was the general counsel to the committee, the re-election of the president, and he proposes why don't we burglarize and wiretap the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Complex in Washington, D.C.? Sounds like a feasible idea. I don't like that, Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien was part of the inner circle for the John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson administration. He was there with the so-called Irish Mafia with Kennedy and Powers and O'Donnell and O'Brien, among others. And he went on to be the liaison for Lyndon Johnson with the United States Senate. So G. Gordon Liddy did know who his target should be or could be. And there he is. There's Lawrence O'Brien. Lawrence O'Brien left as the Democratic head of the Democratic National Committee to become the commissioner of the National Basketball Association with the sole reason of getting a congressional approval of the American Basketball Association and the National Basketball Association merging. He never got that. The ABA kind of folded and they took in 4 teams to get around the merger, but that was basically why he was hired, because he was a political operative, and I got to know him between, say, 1981 and 1983. So I knew him 81, 83. I knew Nixon after 85. May 17th, 1972, the wiretaps are placed on the telephone telephones of Larry O'Brien and the executive director of the Democratic States Chairman R. Spencer Oliver Jr. June the 17th is the day they're going to break in. They already have the practice. They broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles. They know what they're doing. On June 17th, a security guard at the Watergate Complex decided to call police. Should I do this like Jack Webb? Jack Webb, June 17th, 1:30 a.m. Frank Willis, a guard at the Watergate Complex, called us, and 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee's headquarters office. On June 18th, they're identified as González, Barker, McCord, Martínez, and Sturgis. They're all charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of telephone and other communications. This is why sometimes it's good to be a police reporter, because that is what Carl Bernstein was at the Washington Post. And Bob Woodward was the Ivy League guy from Yale who had no idea how to act on the streets as a reporter. Bernstein knew how to work the streets. Woodward didn't. That's why they made a good pair. And there they are. There is Woodward on the left and Bernstein with his Dustin Hoffman type haircut on the right side on the telephone. He was a guy, he was a gumshoe. That's what he did. He walked the streets looking for stories, something Woodward would never have done. On June 19th, Bernstein and Woodward would have the first of their stories that would ultimately take down the president. They would say, one of the Watergate burglars was James McCord. James McCord was a Republican Party security aide. They go into action, and they start a tremendous newspaper story. They had to convince Ben Bradley, Virginia Graham, over at the Washington Post, this was worth pursuing. There's McCord. McCord arrested. This was the AP News Library of April 15, 1973. Woodward and Bernstein continued to develop their sources and work on the story. And they find the source, Deep Throat. We didn't know who Deep Throat was until a long time later, Mark Phillips. The Deep Throat. Anyway, the examination of the burglar's account showed that 1972, there's a link between Creep and the burglars, and it's done through the Subordinate Finance Committee. Woodward and Bernstein are onto something at this point. Presidential election in 1972, it's Richard Nixon against George McGovern, but Nixon prepared for Edmund Muskie. That was the target of the Nixon campaign. Oh, there I am. I'm out there with the people. There's Richard Nixon, and he is out there with the people campaigning in 1972. On August 29th, Nixon decides he has to address what's going on. Nixon, speaking at a news conference, stated, "I can categorically say no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration previously employed was involved in this very bizarre incident." It was a very bizarre incident that he knew nothing about. That's what he was trying to sell. Nixon was kind of strange in the sense that he wanted to be president, but he didn't particularly care about legislation. Not too much legislation was all that important to him, like Title IX, which was passed in 1972, which gave women equal rights to education in American colleges and universities. They were discriminated against until then. And Nixon didn't talk about that. He talked about the civil rights movement and other things. Didn't talk about that at all. A lot of legislation that was passed during his day, Section 8, EOE, and a whole bunch of other things. But that was a liberal agenda, and he did get, because of the liberal agenda, somebody running against him in the 1972 primaries for the Republicans. Oh, it's a little upset. Look at that face. It's just a little upset. On August 30th of 1972, Nixon announced that John Dean completed an internal investigation in the Watergate break-in, and guess what? John Dean found no evidence of the White House involvement. These guys were still going after Nixon. Woodward and Bernstein. Now, there was a guy, some of you might remember, might not remember, a cartoonist by the name of Herb Bloch. Herb Bloch. And his cartoon was signed Herb Bloch as one word. And he had gone after Nixon from the 1950s on. And there was a documentary, and this would be great for the library to get this documentary. It's called Herb Bloch, where Woodward is on, and he said that Herb Bloch came up to them, tapped him on the back, gave him a thumbs up, good job. When Herb Bloch gave them the good job, thumbs up, they knew they were onto something, because back in the 1950s, the cartoons that Herb Bloch was doing showed Nixon as nothing but a crook. September 15th, 1972, a federal grand jury indicts Hunt, Liddy, and the Watergate burglars. There is evidence of a widening conspiracy, but the Nixon Justice Department says, "No, that's it. I'm gone. There's nothing here to see. Don't have to investigate." Closes down the investigation. The Washington Post did not close down their reporting. Woodward and Bernstein reported that Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, once controlled a secret fund to finance intelligence gathering, opposition research, against the Democrat. Carl Bernstein called John Mitchell for a comment. Mitchell threatens Bernstein and Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post. The Post prints the threat. So you got here, the Washington Post is all in by this point. They're not going to take any nonsense from Nixon. They're going after him. And there's Muskie. And Muskie was the guy that the Nixon people were most afraid of. In October of 1972, Bernstein and Woodward and Bernstein report that the FBI made the connections between Nixon aides and the Watergate break-ins. So you got the Washington Post continuing this reporting, and they are finding out things more and more and more. Woodward and Bernstein, and there they are again, and they're working. They're not getting too far. This is taking a while. This is very meticulous work. They're looking for sources, and they're looking for sources, and they're looking to make sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed, because they're going after the President of the United States. Woodward and Bernstein described the existence of a major dirty tricks campaign against Muskie, and that was orchestrated by Donald Segretti and others, paid by Creep, and Nixon's private attorney. So Woodward and Bernstein are going after him. Meanwhile, the American public isn't really giving it much thought. Nixon is elected to a second term in office. He defeats George McGovern, and he does it rather handily. McGovern would only win Massachusetts, and Nixon has got this mandate. He's cleared to go in 1973, and he is going to do whatever he needs to do because he's got a major mandate. He wins 49 of the 50 states, gets 520 electoral votes, 61% of the popular vote, and he beats McGovern by 18 million votes. Somehow, George McGovern, who was a flyer during World War II, is turned into this impish, weak candidate, even though he was a guy who was flying missions during World War II. He was too connected with former hippies, too connected with Simon and Garfunkel and the left. That was the way he was portrayed in 1972. Nixon, of course, was the law and order candidate with the silent majority who had his back. But there were storm clouds brewing, and by the end of 1972, the White House knew there would be trouble ahead in 1973. January 8th, the Watergate burglary trial begins. The 5 defendants would plead guilty. Liddy and McCord are convicted after the trial. Liddy would go on to a successful radio and TV career. It's my business, loves people who were in jail, and that's a fact. And that is Sam Ervin. Sam Ervin in 1973 gained a lot of popularity because he was the guy who was in charge of the committee who was grilling all these people about Richard Nixon. On February 28, 1973, the acting FBI director L. Patrick Gray testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Ervin, who is the Democrat from North Carolina, during his nomination to replace J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI. There were newspaper articles indicating that the White House had possession of the FBI Watergate files, and the committee chairman, Sam Ervin, wanted to know, how did the White House get these files? And there is Gray. And Gray said he'd given the reports to John Dean. Remember, John Dean said nothing to see here, and discussed the FBI investigation with John Dean on many occasions. And it also came out that Gray destroyed important evidence entrusted to him by Dean. Gray's nomination failed. And all of a sudden, John Dean is directly linked to the Watergate cover-up. And John Dean, all of a sudden, is the bad guy here. And Nixon has to do something with John Dean. John Dean had been a loyal soldier until this point. And there is McCord. In a letter to John Sirica, the judge, McCord says the defendants had been pressured into pleading guilty and remained silent, that there was perjury which was committed and others were involved. The plot thickens. In a letter, McCord said that some of it was perjured. They were compelled by pressure from the White House counsel, John Dean, and John Mitchell, the former Attorney General. John Dean, all of a sudden, John Dean starts feeling pressure. March 23rd, the 5 Watergate burglars, along with Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, were sentenced with stiff fines, maximum prison term up to 40 years in jail. That is Camp David over in Maryland. It looks like a nice winter's day in Camp David. You couldn't go swimming unless you were a member of the Polar Bear Club, because it was kind of cold. John Dean is summoned to come up to see Richard Nixon at Camp David, named after, by the way, Nixon's son-in-law, David Eisenhower. Nixon used to see Julie and David all the time in Philadelphia. That's how partly I got to meet Richard Nixon. I'll tell you about that a bit later. On March 22nd, 1973, Nixon calls John Dean and he says, I want to report everything you know about the Watergate matter. You know what? Why don't you come up to Camp David with me there? We'll sit around, we'll kind of talk about it, and we'll do something about it. And John Dean says, uh-oh, there is a problem here. And he starts thinking about, why does Dick Nixon want me here? He goes to Camp David, does some work on the report, and he is one of the cover-up's chief participants. He's in charge of this thing, and yet he's very well involved in this thing. And he begins to realize, you know what? I'm the scapegoat here. I'm the one that they're going to go after. Dean never completes the report. And within 2 months, Dean would be whistling a different tune. There is John Dean. John Dean, who is one of Nixon's counsels, who decides, you know what, I'm going to be going to jail, and I may be going to jail for a long time unless I come up with something. On April 6th, Dean hires an attorney, and he begins cooperation with the Senate Watergate investigators. But he's keeping one foot in the Nixon camp while he's got these attorneys, because he decides he's still there, and he decides, well, I'm going to be the chief White House counsel for a while until I can't, and also cover up efforts, but not disclosing this to Nixon until sometime later. Dean was singing. He was talking to the investigators, and they were able to make their progress because Dean was singing. All of a sudden, Dean had to go before the Senate and give them information. That's Haldeman on the left. That's Ehrlichman on the right. And there's John Dean. And Nixon gets a hold or finds out what's going on. John Dean says to Nixon, I want formal immunity for prosecution for any crimes I might have committed while serving as White House counsel. Nixon says, oh, I don't think so. And because of that, Dean decides, you know what, I better get out of here while the getting is good and start talking to the Senate investigators. On April 19th, he tells Nixon, I'm not going to be the scapegoat for the Watergate scandals. Word had been passed by the associates of Dean that Ehrlichman and Haldeman, they were going to fall as well. All the dominoes are going to flip over. And there's a very quizzical Richard Nixon at one of his news conferences. All of a sudden, on April 30th, Nixon announces the resignation of the Attorney General, Richard Kleinman Dietz, along with Ehrlichman and Haldeman, and he fires John Dean. It's getting real in the White House now. Richard Nixon may be beginning to realize that there are a bunch of things that are going on that are totally out of his control. After accepting the resignation of his aides, Nixon told the American people on April 30th, I accepted full responsibilities for the action of my subordinates in the Watergate scandal. It's over, right? It's over. Ain't over until it's over. It's over. And there's John Dean. And John Dean decides he is going to spill the beans. June 25th, 1973, he begins his testimony before Irvin's committee. The committee had voted to grant him immunity. In his testimony, he implicated the administration officials, including John Mitchell, Nixon, and himself. That is a tape recorder. I'm very familiar with tape recorders. I used to be familiar with tape recorders until things like this, which I'm going to be picking up. That is my tablet. Could record. But Nixon had that. Lyndon Johnson told Nixon, you should record things going on in the White House. You should really record them. In February 1971, a sound-activated taping system was installed in the Oval Office, including in Nixon's desk, and was able to capture audio transmitted by telephone taps and concealed microphones. The system was expanded to include other rooms within the White House and Camp David. He's got all of them. And there is Donald Sanders, who confirmed that there was a taping system on July 13th, 1973, in an interview with the White House aide Alexander Bell. 3 days later, during the public testimony, remember, all this testimony was on in the afternoon instead of soap operas and game shows on the networks. The test of field of Butterfield, when he was asked about the possibility of a White House taping system by Fred Thompson, who went on to be an actor. But he was asked about that, and of course Butterfield decided, yeah, that's it. That is it. That is the tape recorder that Richard Nixon used in the White House. He did confirm it. wasn't even the top of the line tape recorder. That's the amazing part about it. It was a mid-level tape recorder. On July 26th, the committee subpoenaed several White House tapes after Nixon wouldn't give it to them. The accuracy of Dean's testimony was confirmed by the tapes. Tapes don't lie. Sort of like Facebook accounts today and Twitter accounts today. They don't lie. And there is Archibald Cox. In May of 1973, the Harvard law professor and the former U.S. Solicitor General Cox was asked to become a special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate break-in. Cox clashed with the White House over Nixon's refusal to release 10 hours of secret Oval Office recordings, some of them which would implicate the President of the United States in the break-in. I'm not giving it to you. On October 20th, 1973, the Saturday Night Massacre. There was never a movie called that. Saturday Night Fever, Saturday Night Live, but never Saturday Night Massacre. It was owned by Richard Nixon. He fires Cox. He accepted the resignations of Elliot Richardson and the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelhaus. And there they are, the two that decided not to go along with him. On October 20th, Nixon ordered the firing. However, the person with the authority to dismiss Cox, Elliot Richardson, said, I'm not going to do it. So they got to go looking around to find somebody who is going to do this. Richardson resigned. Ruckelhaus becomes acting Attorney General. He says no, he's gone. So that leaves Robert Bork, who, of course, would be a Supreme Court nominee later on. Leaves Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, as the highest-ranking official in the Justice Department, and Bork truthfully carries out the Nixon order, and Cox is gone. There is Robert Bork, and you see Robert Bork in Simpsons, or the caricature of Robert Bork in the Simpsons cartoons going through today. So that was Robert Bork. The reaction to the firing and resignation would force Nixon to appoint another special prosecutor. And that was Bork. Congress would become more interested in what happened at Watergate in June of 1972. And there they are, Archibald Cox and Leon Jaworski. Jaworski would be the next guy who would be in charge of the Nixon cover-up or the Nixon investigation. He would secure a unanimous Supreme Court decision that forced Nixon to release secretly recorded tapes from the Oval Office in July of 1974. But that's my next talk. We're in 1973. There they are. There they are. There is Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. And that was in 1972. Nixon chose Agnew as his running mate because he was the moderate governor of a border state, Maryland, who supported the civil rights movement, but yet made some tough on-crime speeches. Nixon was interested in Vince Lombardi, who had just retired as the Green Bay Packers coach. He thought he'd make a great vice president until he was told Lombardi was a Democrat. Whoops, that's gone. We're not going to do that. And there is Agnew. Agnew is, that is in 1968. You can see Lyndon Johnson there.
69.
And there is Hubert Humphrey, and there is Billy Graham. And then he's taking the oath of office. But Nixon had little faith in Agnew. He trusted him with no responsibility. And Agnew remained stunted and dissatisfied in the position, although he did read speeches written by Patrick Buchanan and William Safire, which basically put down the media. Nixon's support for liberal social and economic policies soured his relationship with some in the Republican Party, and conservatives considered running a protest candidate in the primaries, which would be Ohio's John Ashbrook. Nixon needed Agnew to campaign, and that's why Agnew was around in 1972. There was Ashbrook, who was running for president. In 1972, George Beale, he's the Attorney General for the District of Maryland opened up an investigation of corruption in Baltimore County, Maryland, involving public officials, architects, engineering firms, and paving contractors. And guess who's right in the middle of that? That is Spiro Agnew. Beale's target was the current political leadership in Baltimore County. Agnew had left in 1966 when he became the governor of Maryland. And there is Spiro Agnew and his wife back in the day in 1971-72. Lester Matz's engineering firm was served with a subpoena for documents. It was revealed that Matz had been kicking back 5% of the value of the contracts to Agnew as the Baltimore mayor, and as the governor of Maryland, even though he was gone from Baltimore. He would continue that as Agnew was governor. In 1973, Matz's attorney told Beale his client could show that Agnew not only had been corrupt, but the payments continued to him as he was the vice president of the United States. Now, the statute of limitation would prevent Agnew from being prosecuted for earlier payments, not later payments, in the 60s. And there is Agnew. Agnew is defiant. He is not going down. On August 1st, Beale sent a letter to Agnew's attorney, formally advising him that he was under investigation for tax fraud and corruption. Matz was prepared to testify that he met with Agnew in the White House and gave him $10,000 in cash. Jerome B. Wolfe was the head of Maryland's Road Commission, had extensive documentation that detailed, as Beale put it, every corrupt payment he participated in with then-Governor Spiro Agnew. Agnew felt that the sitting vice president could not be indicted. He met with the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, on September 25th. Albert was a Democrat, asking for an investigation, and he cited this guy, John C. Calhoun. He went back to 1926, and he said Calhoun was alleged to have taken improper payments while a cabinet member, and they decided to wait until he was gone. Albert responded that it would be improper for the House to act in the matter before the courts. Spiro Agnew was in big trouble by this point, as was Richard Nixon. Agnew resigned on October 10, 1973, after the U.S. Justice Department uncovered widespread evidence of his political corruption, including allegations that his practice of accepting bribes had continued into his tenure as the vice president. Agnew had to bargain with prosecutors to avoid prison and finally pleaded no contest to tax evasion. The judge ordered 3 years probation, $10,000 fine. Agnew disappeared from public view. He would never again talk to Nixon. Why? Because he thought Richard Nixon did not have his back. And he went off and golfed and continued his friendship with people like Frank Sinatra, but never to be heard from again. Although he did have a statue in Annapolis unveiled, and he showed up at the statue unveiling as the governor of Maryland. Agnew sends a note to Henry Kissinger. I hereby resign the office of Vice President of the United States effective immediately. And that man, Gerald Ford, would be nominated to take his place. Pursuant to the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, Nixon had to fill the vacancy of the vice president, nominated a candidate who had to be approved by both houses of Congress. Ford was a popular guy. Ford was on the Warren Commission, and he made it through both the Senate and the House. And there they are, working together. Richard Nixon, who really wanted to be some sort of football coach, and Gerald Ford, who's in the College Football Hall of Fame, offensive lineman from the University of Michigan, played in the 1930s. Nixon's appointment of Ford was approved. By December 6th, Ford was sworn in as vice president. Meanwhile, Nixon has another major problem on his hands, as does the world. It's Yom Kippur, and it's the Arabs attacking Israel once again. On October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel, just like they did in 1967, except Israel preempted their attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, taking the Israeli Defense Forces by surprise. Golda Meir did not have them ready. The Egyptian troops swept deep into the Sinai Peninsula while the Syrians struggled into the Gulf of the Golan Heights and trying to get the Israeli occupying force out of the Golan Heights. And that is Anwar Sadat. Sadat knew this was kind of a suicide mission for him, but he tried to roll the dice anyway because he wanted to get some peace talks going with Israel. He was the leader of an economically troubled nation. They could not continue to make war against Israel. He wanted to make peace, recover the Sinai, but Israel was in a much stronger position, and they wanted better terms than Israel would give them, or he thought would give them after the 1967 war. Sadat conceived of a plan. Let's attack Israel again. That might convince Israel that peace is necessary with the Egyptians and get them back to the bargaining table. And there are the tanks in the middle of the Sinai, The war was a major crisis, worldwide proportion. It threatened the long-line stability of the Middle East, but would ratchet up the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Sadat had thrown out 20,000 Soviet advisors in 1972. This was the goal: Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Reclaim the land and prestige that was lost by the 1967 war. Remove Israel as having a better bargaining position and force Israel into negotiations from a weaker position than they were in 1967. There is Golda Meir, the old Milwaukee school teacher, who was the first female prime minister of Israel and one of the few women world leaders in 1973. And there she is with the troops. Israel, their goals were simple: keep the lands that they got in 1967, keep the negotiating positions with Arab states, the PLO, and other Palestinian Arab groups, maintain superior combat effectiveness over the Arab enemies, and but they were not allowed to preemptively strike because Nixon didn't want that to happen, nor did Kissinger, because they did not want Israel to be perceived as the aggressor, and they did not want to risk losing United States support. So here we go. This is where the war took place. Israel trying to defend the Golan Heights, Israel trying to defend the Sinai Desert, and the Arabs coming in from Egypt, also coming in from Syria, as well as Lebanon. The Fourth Israeli-Arab War. Many of the Israeli soldiers were not on duty because of the Yom Kippur holiday. The Arab army, their armies advanced with their updated Soviet weaponry. Iraq forces joined the war. Syria received support from Jordan. The war is on. After several days, it took several days for Israel to get fully mobilized. The Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, began beating back the Arabs. Very heavy costs to both soldiers and equipment on both sides. There is Golda Meir with Richard Nixon in Washington, and Nixon comes in to help out. There are problems with Nixon and Jews, except he's surrounded by Klein and Kissinger and Stein, and he's there to help out Israel. A U.S. airlift of arms aided Israel's cause, but Nixon delayed emergency military aid, and he's sending that as a signal to Egypt: play ball with us, we'll help you out. On October 25th, an Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire is secured by the United Nations. The United States is firmly on Israel's side, but they're trying to play both sides of the candle. And there is Anwar Sadat along with his Egyptian people. Egypt was defeated again, but at the beginning of this war, they were able to gain some ground. And because they were able to gain some ground, Sadat had some prestige in the war, and he was able to mollify all the hawks over in the Arab world. And there's Anwar Sadat, and he's talking to Assad from Syria at that point about what is going on in the war. For Syria, the Yom Kippur War, again, a disaster. Every war that Syria fought against Israel was a disaster. There was an unexpected Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire, and Syria was exposed to military defeat Israel seized more territory in the Golan Heights. And there you see the Israeli flag in the Golan Heights. In 1974, the first of two Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreements provided for the return of portions of the Sinai to Egypt. 1979, Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin were able to come up with a peace. Camp David Accords with Jimmy Carter. Now, the United States did suffer from the Yom Kippur War, gas shortages, sales limited to 10 gallons of gas per customer. That was a Beetle. They didn't need that much gas, the Beatles. On October 19th, 1973, in reaction to what they conceived as America's Israeli bias, 12 OPEC members agreed to an embargo. Over the next 6 months, oil prices quadrupled. OPEC, the last straw came when the United States supported Israel against Egypt on October 19, 1973, in the war. Nixon requested $2.2 billion from Congress in emergency military aid for Israel. The Arab members of OPEC responded by halting oil export to the United States and other Israeli allies. Oil became a weapon. Not only became a weapon in 1973, but it would during the Jimmy Carter administration as well. And there is a picture that is in Manhattan. They actually have a gas station in Manhattan, lower Manhattan, and you can see, make a left turn into that Holland Tunnel. So that is down at Canal Street in lower Manhattan. The Arab oil producers cut off exports to the U.S. That brought soaring gas prices, long lines at filling stations, and in turn would contribute to a major economic downturn in the United States. And that is the American Indian movement. And that is in Wounded Knee. That is in South Dakota. Now, the American Indian movement, AIM, was founded in 1968, and it was done so in an effort to stop police harassment of Indians in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That was 52 years ago. And the AIM group becomes another civil rights group. You gotta remember, in the late 1960s, in 1969, there was the Martin Luther King civil rights group. There was the women's group, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, and others. There was the lesbian and gay group. In Northern Ireland, they are watching all of this, and there's the Catholic group against the Protestants in England and in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. Now, the AIM movement is picking up steam through the years. And in 1973, they go to South Dakota, to the Pine Ridge Reservation. And that's Wounded Knee. And there are numerous problems with the Oglala tribal chairman, Richard Wilson. And the AIM movement decides to go in and see what is going on there. And you can see the Apache Sechin Little Ferry, one of the Native North American activists, to be proper today. And there was Marlon Brando on the left side with Dennis Banks, who founded the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And that picture is from 2015. Little Feather endured booze, mockery, and lies, which she took to the stage at the 1973 Academy Awards to reject an Oscar on behalf of the Best Actor winner, Marlon Brando, in The Godfather, and call for better treatment of Native Americans. One of the things about Wounded Knee, well, there was basically U.S. troops against the protesters. That was a skirmish. The other thing was the AIM people got people like Brando and got other people, Jane Fonda, to support their movement. On February 27th, 71 days of a siege began at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Federal officials and AIM members exchanged gunfire nightly. Hundreds of arrests were made. 2 Native Americans were killed. Federal marshal was permanently paralyzed by a bullet wound. That would end 2 months later. But Wounded Knee becomes important because it is the first battle that AIM really has that sheds the light on problems facing American Indians in the United States. And it showed them, because of Brando and others, that they could have a voice in America, like Martin Luther King did, like Jane Fonda did in 1972, being on the tanks in Hanoi, like lesbians and gays, the movement kicking in there, like the women's movement. They were looking for their voice, and they got a voice starting in 1973. Now, a lot of you now have, well, I don't have my cell phone in front of me. I have my tablet in front of me, except I can make phone calls from this if I wanted to. And in April of 1973, there they are right in the middle of Manhattan. Some guy's got a cell phone. And even in Manhattan, even though this guy has a cell phone, as you can see, people in Manhattan don't care. That was Bell Telephone, wasn't it? Yeah, it was Bell Telephone. They don't care. This guy's got this thing in his ear. There's nobody around him. Nobody's looking at him. That's Manhattan for you. Anyway, that's Martin Cooper, and he makes the first public call on a handheld cell phone while walking down the street in New York, and nobody looks at him. The nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, the technology behind the MRI scanning is developed. On May 14th, Skylab is the first American space station in space. It's launched. Secretariat wins the Belmont by 31 lengths, becomes the first Triple Crown winner in 1973 since 1948 by winning the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont Stakes, won each race in record time. That is my father-in-law, who is quite the groupie. He used to go around with me, particularly when I said we're going to the 21 Club. Who are we seeing today? Billie Jean King. And that's one of my favorite people, Billie Jean King, who helped greatly on my Title IX talk. I give a talk on Title IX, which is when American women and international women going to college in the United States got equal educational opportunities in college, thanks to me, Richard Nixon, in 1972. So that's my father-in-law, Billie Jean King. I've had a long relationship with Billie Jean King. And Billie Jean King is involved in a network spectacular hosted by Howard Cosell, put together by my friend Shelley Saltman, who is the promoter of the Battle of the Sexes. That was a big deal in 1973. Shelley was in charge of that, which is why it became what it became, more than just the Battle of the Sexes. September 20th, 1973, 30,000 fans filled the Houston Astrodome to watch Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King. And there were celebrities. Shelley is not going to have a program without celebrities. And he's got Salvador Dali there, and he's mingling with what appeared to be aliens in tuxedos. This is a full Shelley show. And there he is. There is Shelley Saltman, who passed away last February, or February of 2019, with me in, outside of Los Angeles in November of 2015. Shelley, if you're around, you know I loved you, and I miss your calls, but I keep you alive. King enters the playing court, and this is a Shelley idea. He called it the Cleopatra entrance. She enters the playing court on gold litter, carried by 4 shirtless members of the Rice University track team, while Riggs arrives in a rickshaw, flocked by a bevy of Bobby's bosom buddies. And Shelley picked out the women. They had to have D cups or better. That was Bobby's bosom buddies. They exchanged pre-game gifts, a baby pig for the chauvinist Bobby Riggs, a giant sugar daddy lollipop for King, because Shelley got sugar daddy to sponsor Bobby Riggs. And there they are, Riggs and Billie Jean King. Remember, and this is Billie Jean talking to me. This is Billie Jean King and the conversation we had. Remember, Title IX had just been passed. I really didn't want it to be weakened. She thought by losing to a 55-year-old Bobby Riggs that people would just dismiss Title IX, which gave women also equality in sports at college campuses. Now, Bobby Riggs took on Margaret Court earlier that year and beat Margaret Court. Bobby Smith was 55 years old. I thought with Margaret Court losing, it would be a good chance for some of the people to start jumping on the bandwagon to weaken Title IX. Heard our tour, the women's tour, which came about because Billie Jean King was almost blackballed by the tennis people. That's a long story, and that's part of another talk I do about athletes and protests. Hurt our tour, hurt women's sports, hurt the women's movement. As soon as I found out Margaret had lost, I knew I definitely was going to play Bobby Riggs. I did not have any choice. By 2008, she told me, what the hell was I doing? If I beat him, he was a 55-year-old guy. If I lose to him, a woman lost to a 55-year-old guy. I was in a no-win position. Why did I do it? I said, because she wanted money. She said that was part of it. And that's how it goes. So I am friendly with his grandsons, Justin and Colin. Colin is the public relations director of the public announcer of the New York Mets. He's not public relations director, he's the PA announcer for the New York Mets. I'll tell you why I win, said Riggs. She's a woman, and they don't have emotional stability. This kind of thing that was going on at that point. Well, Billie Jean King would beat Bobby Riggs. And it would lead to another career. Billie Jean King on TV. Here she is with Jack Klugman as Oscar Madison in The Odd Couple. Oddly enough, Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs became really good friends after this. And as Riggs was living out his life, the money was running out, and he needed money for medical aid, Billie Jean King stepped up and gave him the money he needed. She kind of supported him when he was going through, at the end of life, medical expenses. Billie Jean King told me she really did like Bobby Riggs. And it was an exhibition. It really was an exhibition. As Shelley said, made for TV extravaganza. Shelley would go on to other things like the Battle of the Network Stars on television, among other things. Billie Jean King, though, thought she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. On November 7th, the state of New Jersey, this is the real human rights advancement, not the thing that Shelley put together. November 7th, New Jersey becomes the first state to allow girls to participate in Little League Baseball. There's Yogi. In 1973, Yogi Berra came up with maybe his most famous saying. It was in September of 1973 when the sports writer Mike Dyer from the Long Island Press was in a scrum after a game. Manager Yogi Berra of the New York Mets. This is your typical scrum. This picture is from 2006 at the Yogi Berra Museum up in Little Falls, New Jersey, Montclair State University. And Mets they're not having a really good season. Grody is injured, Jerry Grody is injured, Tom Seaver is injured. They have a lot of injuries. But nobody's running away with the National League East. And somehow the Mets are hanging in and hanging in and hanging in September. And mathematically, they have a really good shot at winning the National League East, but they got to win virtually every one of their games. Time is running out. Mike Dyer asks the question, is it over, Yogi? Big letdown here. You're going to think there's a great story here. Ain't a great story. Is it over, Yogi? Yogi says, ain't over till it's over. And this talk ain't over till it's over. One more picture. Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. Because 1974, remember, Ford becomes vice president in December of 1973. 1974 is only days away. And that's when it will be over for Richard Nixon. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Could open up could open everybody's mic up for questions, comments. I don't know I got to figure out how to open up everything here, which I don't know how to do. I guess I know how to do this now.
Hello, Evan.
Hello, unmute everybody. Hello, Kent. Anyway, any questions, comments, or remembrances from 1973?
The one thing that I remember from 1973 is I was in boarding school in North Dakota when that whole thing happened in South Dakota. I was about 150 miles away, and I remember the Native Americans that were at the school at the time were like they would they wanted to go home. They wanted to go back to Arizona or Fort Yates or wherever they were from because they didn't want to be a part of the school. And the administrator, who was one of the most famous disabled people at the time in the country, Ann Carlson, the school is named after her now, said, we'll address your needs. And they did. And they got better. They got better dormitory services, and they got to eat together and all that. So that's basically what I remember from Wounded Knee. Other thing that I remember, and it was in Rachel Maddow's podcast, that um, George Bush Sr. Was asked by Nixon, because he was the head of the RNC at the time, to go to B. Hall the Eighth, George B. Hall the Eighth, and ask him not to prosecute Agnew. And the other thing is that there was talk at one point, there was talk of a double impeachment in 1973 of both Nixon and Agnew, and little Carl Albert or Alpert would have been the president of the United States.
Yeah. Rich, can you unmute Rich? Because I can't unmute Rich because he's got the journalism school, or actually the journalism blog. Rich, I'm a journalist and you've been a journalist too. Let's talk about Woodward and Bernstein for a little while, and the Washington Post, which showed some gumption back in 1972-73, and keeping this ball rolling, because they could have folded. Ben Bradley could have folded, and Catherine Graham could have folded just as easily and say, okay, you know, it's a nothing burglary.
Right.
I don't know if Rich can hear me, but
yeah, I just turned my mic on. I didn't hear the question though.
No, you know, as a journalist, and you were a former journalist, I think you did politics for a while. Talking about Woodward, Bernstein, Catherine Graham, and Ben Bradley, how they showed a lot of gumption continuing this story, which was dismissed as just a minor burglary.
Yeah, I think you touched on it. I mean, the pressure they got where, you know, they wanted to, I think, you know, one of them made a call and they called the editor, they called the publisher. And, you know, as you said, they really didn't back down. And, you know, today we know the Washington Post as it is now, and it was a powerful paper back then. But, you know, they were really going out on a limb, and they were doing things that, you know, there's a book by Larry Sabato where he talks about 4 errors of journalism. And prior to this point, you know, he called it lapdog journalism. The, you know, White House press corps more or less wrote what was given to them. But around the things that you talked about, the Vietnam War, Watergate, reporters became more skeptical. And I think that was, you know, one of the lasting legacies of Watergate, that journalism, it was really a pivotal moment for journalism. And they, you know, became, you know, more aggressive. Some people might argue that too aggressive, but certainly they went from what, you know, Sabato says, lapdog journalism to watchdog journalism.
Yeah, the thing about the Washington Post back in those days was it was the third paper in town, and they outlasted everybody. They had Herb Block, who and I do recommend to all of you, if you can, in the library as well, Plainsboro Library, get a hold of the documentary called Her Block. It is fascinating. You would think cartoonists had no power. They just cartoon and just an opinion. But Herb was one of the powerhouses of Washington, and I suggest that the library and everybody else should see Herb Block. It's just a great documentary. And Herb was one of the people who went after Nixon. And I think because he went after Nixon, that was part of what the Washington Post is all about. The other thing was Washington Post was trying to really establish itself as a predominant paper in Washington, D.C. I remember in 1984-85, I was covering the National Football League, United States Football League trial at Foley Square, the Southern District of Manhattan. And Pete Rozelle was commissioner of the National Football League, and I was talking to him one day, and I said, "What do you read?" He said, "I read two newspapers. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Those are the only two papers that matter." And when Rozelle took office in 1960, the Washington Post didn't matter. Watergate really put them on the map.
Yeah, and I think, they also were driven by competition. We all know about Woodward and Bernstein, but the New York Times was doing some great work, and they were, constantly trying to outscoop each other.
Yeah, well, the New York Times got the Pentagon Papers in 1971 until they couldn't get the Pentagon Papers. If you remember, they were, a judge ruled they couldn't print it. So Ellsberg gave it to 10 different papers, including the Washington Post. They printed it, and then the New York Times printed it. And that was a best-selling book in 1972, the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah. And the subject of the movie, The Post, which won an Academy Award a few years ago.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody from the library who wants to say anything? Anyway, I want to thank you for. I'm going to thank everybody for being here. And it's early Saturday morning, and in some time zones, like David Webb, I saw was on. It's 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. So I want to thank you for spending part of your Saturday with me, and thank the library for having me.
Okay. Thanks, Evan. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'll talk to you. We got to do something at St. Bonaventure.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you offline.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else? The library. Anybody else? Kent, I'll speak to you. Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope, as Joe Franklin would say, you enjoyed your stroll down memory lane. And let's thank the Plainsboro Library for inviting me. And I hope it was a good time that you had as well at the library. And maybe we could do this again in person one day. And 4 weeks from today, I'm going to be doing a talk on Ted Turner and how Ted Turner changed everybody's life and how we did it.
Ha 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 ha. And he did it with Daddy's money.
Daddy committed suicide. That's why Ted took over the company. Okay, thanks. I want to thank the library for inviting me.
Bye,
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, and we will see you same bat time, same bat channel 4 weeks from today.
Yes.
So thank you so much for inviting me. I hope I did a good job for you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be